She had faced tough questions before, but this wasn't about getting answers. This was a setup, a trap laid in front of rolling cameras waiting for her to step into it. And when she refused to play the game, the entire room held its breath because everyone knew what was about to happen next. The press briefing room buzzed with tension, the kind that clung to the air, heavy and unspoken. The Washington, D.C. press corps was gathered, cameras lined up in the back like a silent jury, waiting to capture every moment, every flicker of emotion, every slip of the tongue that could be turned into a headline. At the podium stood Karoline Leavitt, poised, professional, and in complete control. She had faced tough crowds before, had sparred with journalists who came armed with leading questions and rehearsed outrage. But today felt different. There was a hum beneath the surface, an expectation that something was about to happen. She adjusted the microphone, scanning the room briefly before offering a crisp nod. "Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started." Hands shot up immediately, eager voices, hungry for their turn. Caroline pointed to a familiar face from a major network. "Ms. Leavitt, the administration's latest policy on tax cuts. Some say it disproportionately benefits the wealthy. How do you respond?" A practiced smile, a firm, polished answer. She had done this 100 times before. Control the message. Keep the room moving. Another question, this time about education reform. Another smooth response. Then it happened. A voice cut through the room, sharper than the rest. "Ms. Leavitt, let's talk about the real issue here." Caroline recognized the voice instantly. The liberal reporter. Everyone in this room knew her. Aggressive, theatrical, and always looking for that viral moment. She was seated near the front, her pen tapping rhythmically against her notepad, a knowing smirk playing on her lips. Caroline held her gaze. "Go ahead." The reporter didn't waste a second. "Do you believe this administration's policies are designed to suppress marginalized communities? Because the data suggests—" Caroline lifted a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I've answered that question before. The administration is focused on policies that benefit all Americans. If you have a question related to today's topic, I'm happy to continue." A few murmurs rippled through the room, but the reporter wasn't done. She leaned in further. "You didn't actually answer the question, though. Can you directly address whether—" "I did answer," Caroline interrupted, her tone firm but controlled. She glanced around, silently signaling that she was ready to move on. For a moment, the room seemed to settle. A brief pause, as if things might return to normal. But then, "I just don't see why you're avoiding it," the reporter pressed. "It's a simple yes or no. Are these policies suppressing marginalized groups?" The temperature in the room shifted. Reporters exchanged glances, some intrigued, others visibly uncomfortable. No one liked when a press conference turned into a showdown. Caroline exhaled slowly. "I'm not avoiding anything. I'm staying on topic. If you have a question related to today's discussion, I'll gladly answer. If not, I'll be moving on." But the reporter wasn't backing down. She leaned even closer to the microphone. "So that's a no comment?" The energy in the room tightened. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone's shoulders. This was no longer a press conference. This was a spectacle. A hush fell over the room. No one spoke. But the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. Caroline adjusted her stance, placing both hands on the podium. "I've answered your question. I'll be moving on now." She pointed to another journalist in the back. But before they could speak, "Why is it so hard for you to give a straight answer?" A flicker of irritation crossed Caroline's face. Not much, just a brief tightening around the eyes. But enough. For those paying attention, it was a tell. She knew reporters had a job to do. She respected that. But there was a difference between pressing for accountability and hijacking an event for personal gain. And right now it was crystal clear which one this was. A few cameras panned from Caroline to the reporter, capturing every shift in body language, every subtle movement that could be spun into a headline. Caroline inhaled through her nose. "I don't believe in wasting anyone's time. If you have a new question, I'll answer it. Otherwise, I'd like to give others a chance." The reporter smirked. "Sure. New question. Why is this administration so afraid of transparency?" A quiet gasp. Some reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the moment escalating. Karoline blinked. A measured, controlled reaction. Her grip on the podium tightened for a second before she let go. She smiled, but not the warm, diplomatic kind. This was a different smile, one that said, "I see exactly what you're trying to do." She took her time before responding. "Transparency? That's exactly what this administration stands for. But what you're doing isn't about transparency. It's about theatrics." The words hung in the air. The reporter's smirk faltered. Another journalist seated near the back cleared his throat. "Karoline, if I could—" But again the same voice interrupted. "So you're dismissing valid concerns as theatrics? The American people deserve real answers." The cameras caught everything. The slight tilt of Karoline's head. The way the other journalists shifted in their seats. Some clearly frustrated that the event had been hijacked. A veteran journalist, someone who had covered politics for decades, leaned back and muttered to a colleague, "This isn't journalism. This is performance art." But the reporter didn't care. She knew exactly what she was doing. The longer she kept this going, the more likely it was to go viral. And a confrontation like this, it was gold for social media. Karoline saw it too. She had a choice: engage and give the moment more fuel, or shut it down entirely. She sighed. Then finally she looked toward security at the side of the room. She didn't have to say anything. The shift in her gaze was enough. The room tensed. Everyone knew what that meant. This was no longer just an argument. It was about to escalate. The air felt heavier now. No one was speaking, but the tension held everyone in place. The reporter saw it too. Her smirk returned, small but visible. This was what she wanted. Karoline straightened. "I'll say this one more time. If you have a relevant question, I will answer it. But I won't engage in bad faith arguments." The reporter chuckled. "Bad faith? I'm doing my job. Isn't that what a free press is for?" Karoline didn't blink. A free press is about holding people accountable. What you're doing is trying to turn this into a spectacle. The room rippled with murmurs. Some reporters stole quick glances at each other, sensing the shift. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was something else now. The reporter tapped her pen once on the table. Then she asked the question that would change everything. "Are you refusing to answer because you can't, or because you don't want to?" Silence. A sharp inhale from someone in the room. Karoline exhaled, measuring her response. "I am refusing to play a game." Her voice was calm, controlled. But the moment was far from over. The smirk on the reporter's face widened. She knew she had pushed Karoline into a corner. At least that's what she wanted the cameras to capture. The tension in the room was suffocating. Other journalists shifted in their seats, some visibly frustrated that the briefing had devolved into a back-and-forth spectacle. But the reporter had no intention of letting go. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "Right, because expecting transparency is a game." This time, the murmurs in the room weren't just background noise. A few reporters whispered to each other. Others stole glances at Karoline, waiting for her next move. Karoline had dealt with difficult reporters before. But this was something else. This wasn't about policy. This was about control. She adjusted the microphone slightly, took a deliberate step back from the podium, and exhaled slowly. "I think we're done here." The room went still. The reporter blinked, a beat of hesitation. "Excuse me." Karoline didn't flinch. "You've made it clear that you're not interested in an actual discussion. You're looking for a headline. If you'd like to stay and listen to the rest of the press conference, you're welcome to, but I won't be answering any more of your questions." A quiet chuckle from the reporter. She shook her head, knowing exactly how this moment would play out on social media. So, silencing the press. Got it. Karoline's jaw tightened. She knew that line was coming. She knew exactly how this would be spun the second the cameras went off. She glanced toward security. A subtle, wordless signal. And just like that, everything changed. People shifted in their seats. The energy in the room snapped from tense anticipation to full-blown confrontation. This was no longer just an argument. This was about to become something much bigger. A ripple of unease passed through the room. The journalists weren't just watching now. They were recording every second, waiting to see how far this would go. The hum of camera shutters clicking filled the space. capturing the exact moment Karoline glanced at security. The reporter noticed it too. Her smirk disappeared. "You're seriously doing this?" Her voice was lower now, but sharp enough to slice through the room. Karoline didn't answer. A uniformed officer stationed by the door took a slow step forward. He didn't need to say anything. The meaning was clear. The reporter had two options: de-escalate or double down. She chose the latter. "This is unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. Then louder, so the cameras would catch it. "So much for freedom of the press, huh?" Karoline remained still. Freedom of the press doesn't mean hijacking a press conference. The reporter let out a dry laugh, looking around the room as if inviting the other journalists to agree with her. Some shifted uncomfortably, a few scribbled notes, but no one spoke. The security officer took another step. For a split second, the reporter hesitated. She could stand her ground, make them physically remove her. That would be a moment, a viral sensation. Or she could get up, walk out on her own terms, and control the narrative another way. Karoline watched as the decision played out behind the reporter's eyes. Then slowly, the woman reached for her notepad. She stood, adjusted the strap of her bag. "This is a disgrace," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough to be picked up by the mics. Then one final jab before she turned toward the exit. "You can kick me out, but you can't silence the truth." Karoline didn't respond. The door closed behind the reporter. And just like that, it was over. Or at least it should have been. The silence that followed was thick. No one was sure what to do next. The cameras were still rolling. Some journalists kept their eyes down, pretending to scribble notes. Others just stared. Then, from the back of the room, a voice. "Karoline, do you think this was the right decision?" She turned her gaze toward the journalist who had spoken. "I think it was necessary." Another voice. "You don't think this will backfire?" Karoline knew it would. She knew by the time she left this room, the internet would already be flooded with clips. She could already see the headlines. Karoline Leavitt removes reporter for asking tough questions. But did it matter? She straightened. "We're here to have discussions, not disruptions. If anyone else has real questions, I'm happy to answer them." A beat of hesitation. Then slowly, a hand went up. The press conference continued. But the real storm, it was just beginning. By the time Karoline stepped off the podium, her phone was already buzzing. Staff members hovered near the edge of the room, whispering in hushed tones, their faces tense as they glanced between their screens and the door the reporter had walked out of minutes ago. She didn't need to check her notifications to know what was happening. The clip was spreading, fast. As she walked down the hallway toward her office, one of her aides caught up with her, phone in hand. "It's already trending. Hashtag silencing. The press is picking up steam." Karoline exhaled through her nose. "Of course it is." The aide hesitated. "The major outlets are running with it. Some headlines are fair, just reporting what happened. But others," she trailed off, scrolling. "Leavitt shuts down press freedom. Reporter escorted out for speaking truth to power." Karoline stopped walking. "Speaking truth," she repeated, half a laugh, half a scoff. She wasn't speaking truth. She was performing. The aide nodded. "Doesn't matter. That's not how it's being framed." Karoline had known this was coming the second she locked eyes with security. This was how these moments played out. Clip the tension, cut out the context, slap on a dramatic headline, and let the outrage machine take care of the rest. Still, she wasn't about to panic. She had been in politics long enough to know that narratives could shift. "What about our base?" she asked, pushing open the door to her office. The aide followed her in. "They're backing you. Conservative commentators are calling it a win, saying you handled it with professionalism. The usual names are defending you." Karoline nodded. "And the White House?" A pause. "They're distancing themselves. But they're not condemning you. Yet." That last part hung in the air. Karoline leaned against her desk, arms crossed. "And her?" The aide didn't have to ask who she meant. She scrolled again, eyes flicking over her screen. "She's leaning into it. Did a live interview already. Called it a chilling moment for press freedom. She's getting booked on every major network." Of course she was. Karoline tilted her head back, staring at the ceiling for a brief second before pushing off the desk. She wanted this. The aide bit her lip. So, what's the play here? Karoline didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, looking down at the street below. Reporters were already gathering outside, waiting for her next move. She had a choice. Stay quiet, let the moment run its course, or get ahead of it, before the narrative hardened. Her jaw tightened. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning.